Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salebox for the 27th of November 2014. My name is TotalBiscuit, running up today's Steam deals. The deals featured in the show, with the exception of the deal of the day, will be running for 48 hours. That means if you missed yesterday's Salebox, don't worry, the deals are still there. You can find them below the giant pile of other deals that Steam is doing. Later on in the sale, I'll be doing a Hidden Gems video, where I'll be pointing out some of the stuff that will probably not get highlighted on the front page. But for the time being, we'll be focusing on featured deals and a deal of the day, which will only be running for 24 hours. So make sure to jump on that one. It's probably pretty damn good. In this case, it is very damn good. So, without further ado, let's begin, shall we, with BioShock Infinite, 75% off. This one's been on sale quite a bit. I pretty much have the dissenting opinion when it comes to BioShock Infinite. The vast majority of critics seem to believe that BioShock Infinite is an absolutely amazing game, and visually it is, in terms of its storytelling it is, but I did have a number of problems with it, most specifically in terms of its mechanics and the way that the world was designed. The game was highly linear, the limitation of only 2 weapons was absolutely infuriating, the gunplay in and of itself hasn't really advanced too much since the original BioShock, and frankly, BioShock didn't do a particularly good job of the gunplay either. That was not its strength at all. I also really didn't like how they implemented Elizabeth in that game. A lot of people praised the way that they'd done the AI partner, but it seemed to me like the way that they made her work was to have her become completely irrelevant to the world, which made very little sense, because it seemed like the entirety of Columbia was trying to get Elizabeth back and put her back in the tower, and yet they don't do it. Elizabeth is effectively invisible in all of these fights and becomes a glorified vending machine, which is why I find it a little bit strange that some people believe that she's a really amazing character, at least from a mechanical standpoint. So, I am not the world's biggest fan of BioShock Infinite, that I will make abundantly clear, but a lot of people are. It is a wonderful story, it's a wonderfully designed world, some of the most amazing aesthetic I've seen in a very long time. And they've also discounted, to some degree, the Burial at Sea episodes, although only 50% off for that. If you grab the Season Pass, however, you are going to get a good discount. Otherwise, Burial at Sea would cost you $15, the original equivalent. With the Season Pass, it costs you $10. You also get Clash in the Clouds, which is kind of a wave-based sort of waste of time, and Columbia's Finest, which is a couple of upgrade packs, little DLC. But the Burial at Sea titles are actually quite good. I enjoyed them a great deal. I think it helped that it was just a smaller, more focused experience. Plus, the difference between Burial at Sea Part 1 and Part 2 means that the game just remains interesting throughout. So, yeah, I'm gonna say that BioShock Infinite for that price is clearly worth it. It's a AAA title that a lot of people really enjoy, and I have an outspoken opinion on it. It really is as simple as that. Bear in mind, you can also pick up the triple pack. This is good value, because you get BioShock 1, 2, and Infinite for 83% off. So for a couple extra dollars, you get BioShock 1 and 2. And my other dissenting opinion is BioShock 2 is the best of the series. Come at me. Kerbal Space Program. 40% off. Not a big discount. This game never really needs to be discounted. This is one of the only titles on Early Access that I don't really have much hesitation in recommending. This is a really original game. Reminds me of some of the edutainment games I used to play when I was a kid, but if I'd had this as a kid, if we'd had this in science classes as kids, I have a feeling a lot more people would be very interested in space and physics. This is a very well executed space exploration game whereby you build your own rocket ships and see whether or not you can get Kerbals into space without blowing them up. This game has a thriving mod scene, consistently added content, and is a lot of fun to play if you like to experiment. It can be as complicated or as simple as you so desire. I played it quite a long time ago and found it compelling. Now it's got so much more content. It's still in early access, which again is very strange. And this will be one of the only times I'm going to tell you, you know what, right now in its current state, it's absolutely worth the price they're asking for. Wolfenstein The New Order, 66% off. Maybe not the biggest discount, considering that game is still very much full price, so some people are going to be a little bit disappointed that it's not super cheap. However, I've got to say, this is absolutely one of my favorite games of the year at this point. Really, really surprisingly good, especially considering I had a very poor impression of it when I played it at PAX. Turns out that impression was completely wrong. The introductory sequence, just ignore it. Toss it out the window, because the rest of the game, phenomenal. Really, really good. single-player first-person shooter. It's got replay value, it's got a bunch of collectibles and secret codes which will unlock a bunch of different modes. It's also got alternate timelines depending on a certain decision that you make. So there's a reason to play it, in my opinion, at least twice. The dialogue is surprisingly great. The gunplay's a lot of fun. And they simultaneously managed to make a very strange alt history game that's not afraid to do silly things like go into space, but simultaneously has some very grounded dialogue and some really interesting characters, which again I found very, very surprising. So to me, Wolfenstein: The New Order is absolutely bang on. There are some minor PC port issues, so please do go look at PCGamingWiki.com and go and find out what's up with that. Some people had some problems with this game. Personally, for me, it ran absolutely fine, with the exception of the fact that it's locked to 60 frames per second for some reason. Beware, however, this is an id Tech 5 game, yes indeed, the infamous mega textures, which means that there may be problems on AMD systems. You'll want to look up some information in regards to that before you try and play this game if you happen to have an AMD system. Shadow of Mordor, 33% off. Not a big discount, is it? But this is a game that's been selling very well, so it's not surprising to see that it's not been gutted in terms of its price. This is a game that came out and not a lot of people really had a huge amount of hype for it, and then it turned out, again, to be one of the best games of the year. It's an open-world action-adventure or spectacle fighter, kind of in the vein of Batman Arkham City, and you play a ranger who is in Mordor doing things that you would do in Mordor, like collecting flowers and murdering hundreds of orcs. The thing which sets it apart from everything else is, of course, the Nemesis system, which allows you to set orcs against each other and meddle with the balance of power in the region. And it turns out it's a very, very good system indeed, particularly once you start being able to control the orcs using a branding power. So you can mess around a great deal with that. Since the patches and the fact that it's now got SLI support, the game seems to run really, really well on my system anyway. I'm getting consistent 100 FPS, which is what the game is capped to for some reason. And generally speaking, it is a really good port, so it is something you should be looking into. If you do like your open-world action adventures, this is one of the best that came out this year. Although the price may be somewhat off-putting, if you can be patient, wait till next year, or wait till Christmas, and I'm sure it will be significantly cheaper. Age of Empires 2 HD, 80% off. I've covered this one several times before, and I've put across the opinion that this is not a particularly good HD remake. I mean, really all they did was just kind of zoom things out. They didn't really improve the assets all that much, and unfortunately the matchmaking and the multiplayer still just doesn't work all that well. Though since launch they have patched it a number of times and it works a little bit better than it did, but there are still people complaining about the multiplayer in Age of Empires HD Edition. It's not a particularly great HD edition, but they have improved it somewhat. They've even improved the AI, so it's not like it's particularly expensive. If you are looking to play Age of Empires, there are definitely worse ways to do it, especially if you just want to play the single-player campaigns. It's entirely functional, it works fine, and it's extremely cheap. But if you are expecting a complete overhaul, that is not what this game is at all. It is a little bit of spit and polish and multiplayer which only works sometimes. Banished, 60% off. This is something of a city builder, but it's more of a survival game as far as I'm concerned. And when I initially played it, it was a little bit bare bones. The idea is to create a village that can survive through the harsh winters and is actually producing enough food and enough clothing and firewood in order to do so. And things can go very, very wrong very quickly, especially if you expand a little bit too fast. It is a game that's quite tricky, frankly, and should be treated with patience and with care. Now, since November, they've actually brought the modding tools to the game. Finally, it took them quite some time to actually do this, but they have modding tools for the game now. Steam Workshop has been integrated into the game, which means that in future, I think that this game's going to have a lot of content. On launch, it really didn't have all that much. Like, tech-wise, there wasn't really a lot to do. The production chains were, frankly, very, very simple, but it did have that really nice survival aspect that most of these city builders really don't have. It just doesn't have a lot of replayability in its current state, because there really isn't a great deal of complexity to it. Once you've actually learned the formulas behind it, it's really not that tricky, but I have high hopes for this game with the modding kit. Problem is, you don't sell a game based on mods that might come around. You sell it based on how it is now, so it's a bit of a cautious recommendation from me. Payday 2, 75% off for the umpteenth time. This game gets discounted an awful lot, and frankly, this game has become something of a phenomenon, particularly on PC. It is an incredibly popular co-op game. It is consistently played by a huge amount of people, and there's a lot of content that's been added in, although they've also added in a great deal of DLC as well, which I suppose is to be expected. A lot of free stuff, though. Like, half the DLC is actually free. So a lot of free heists. You can buy some different game modes and some different weapons and characters. But all of this stuff is also heavily discounted, so this is an ideal time to pick up all of the DLC for Payday 2. The game is fairly unique in the sense that it is sort of a wave-based co-op shooter, but simultaneously it has a great deal of mechanics tied into the idea that you're working a heist, and it's not just a kill all the cops thing. Sometimes it devolves into that, but you can do missions purely through stealth and subterfuge, which I really like. The main problem with getting into Payday right now is if you don't have a bunch of friends to do it with, the AI absolutely sucks, and it's difficult to actually level your characters up, and the chances are you're going to get kicked from any games if you're inexperienced. So, to me, it's a very difficult game to currently break into, but if you buy a 4-pack and you get in there with your friends on the ground floor, then you should have a great deal of fun. Or find a friend that's willing to tutor you in the ways of the Payday, because there's a ton of co-op enjoyment to be had in this game, and frankly, I like their business model a lot. These guys have been really successful, and frankly, they've treated their community well, as far as I can see. So, it does seem like the sort of thing that is worth a shot if you're willing to get through that initial learning curve. Spintires, 66% off. This is one of those really strange titles which actually ended up being critically acclaimed and actually had a lot of success on YouTube as well. It was kickstarted, it did really, really well, and it gained a lot of traction on YouTube, and it's a simulator where you drive a bunch of heavy Russian vehicles, and it apparently has some really nice driving physics when dealing with mud. However, it does seem like the game ended up being somewhat unfinished, like they were expecting a lot more content to be added to the game, and that hasn't actually happened. It seems like they were very late on the patches, and they've only really just started going right now, which is weird because the game came out in June. So, if you're really into the idea of driving these big Russian vehicles around, especially if you happen to have a co-op partner for it, since it is focused on that, you're probably going to have a whale of a time with this thing. It's very niche, but it's actually got quite a lot of popularity amongst other people who are perhaps not into the simulator genre, just because driving big vehicles in the mud is a lot of fun for a lot of people, I suppose. But just bear in mind that it may not quite have the content that you were looking for. Do go investigate the forums, read what the veteran players have to say before you go on, because a lot of people are complaining about a lack of updates and lack of promised content. And that brings us on to the deal of the day. Please bear in mind, this deal is only available for 24 hours, less so now that the video's out. So you got to grab this one today or early tomorrow morning, otherwise you're going to miss out on it. It's got to be Shadow Warrior, 90% off, an incredible discount for an incredible game. This was in my top 5, or was it top 6, of last year, 2013. Now, this game is absolutely fantastic. It is a first-person shooter with a very competent, indeed, one might be able to argue that the melee element is better than the first-person shooter component, although they're both pretty damn good. It is a remake of the good old Shadow Warrior from 3D Realms. It keeps a lot of the original sense of humor and the nonsense, but adds in a really nice-looking graphics engine, some absolutely fantastic combat, and a full-on katana melee system with a bunch of different special powers and unlockable moves. It's by Flying Wild Hog, that's got a lot of the ex-Painkiller guys behind it, and they also brought Hard Reset, which, again, in my opinion, was a very good game. It is fantastic. I would strongly, strongly recommend it. It is a single-player only game. That is not a bad thing. It is a very good single-player game. Some really fun boss fights, some really excellent katana combat, great variety of weapons, and a decent sense of humor to go along with it. Somewhat corny, but a decent sense of humor nonetheless. And at 90% off, there's no way in a million years that I wouldn't recommend this. Shadow Warrior is bang on. Alright folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Salebox. And if you happen to be celebrating Turkey Day, then happy Turkey Day. And we'll see you next time.